Imagine this: the most powerful empire in the world, its legions seemingly invincible, marching confidently through a dark German forest. These soldiers have conquered Gaul, crushed rebellions, and brought civilization to the farthest corners of the known world. Led by Roman Senator Quintilius Varus, these 3 legions marched into a dark forest with their bronze armor gleaming even in the shadows of the towering trees. Their shields bear the proud emblem of Rome, and their disciplined ranks move like a well-oiled machine through territory they believe they've already conquered. But something is about to go terribly, catastrophically wrong. In 3 days of unspeakable horror, a ragtag barbarian force annihilated all 3 legions, leaving the Roman Emperor Augustus to pace around his palace at night, crying out in anguish, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a trauma so severe that it would echo through the corridors of power in Rome for generations, fundamentally altering the course of European history. Welcome back to Ancient Rome Revisited. I'm your host, Marcus Aurelius, and I thank the gods that I didn't suffer this particular military defeat during my reign as emperor. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, one of the most shocking reversals of fortune in military history, where Roman arrogance met Germanic cunning in the most brutal way possible. You're going to learn about Rome's ambitious plans to extend its empire beyond the Rhine River and transform the wild Germanic tribes into obedient Roman citizens. You'll learn how Arminius, a Germanic prince raised in Rome itself, orchestrated the most devastating betrayal in ancient history. You will then witness the terrifying 3-day massacre that unfolded in the Teutoburg Forest, where Roman discipline crumbled against Germanic fury. We'll finish by analyzing the critical mistakes, fatal overconfidence, and strategic blunders that turned Rome's greatest strength into its most catastrophic weakness. Now grab your blanket, sit down and strap in, because this is the story of how an empire's hunger for conquest led it straight into the jaws of disaster. Chapter 1. The Eagle's Shadow. To understand why Rome suffered such a devastating defeat, we need to understand what brought them into that cursed forest in the first place. This wasn't some random military expedition gone wrong. This was the culmination of decades of Roman ambition colliding with Germanic resistance. By 9 CE, Rome had already achieved what seemed impossible. Julius Caesar had conquered Gaul, bringing the Celtic tribes to heel through a combination of brilliant military strategy and ruthless brutality. The Rhine River had become Rome's northern frontier, but for Augustus Caesar, Julius's adopted son and the first Roman emperor, this simply wasn't enough. The Rhine wasn't a boundary, it was a launching pad. Augustus had a vision that would make even his legendary predecessor green with envy. He wanted to push Roman control all the way to the Elbe River, effectively doubling the size of the empire's European territories. This wasn't just about glory or wealth, though those certainly played their part. Augustus understood that controlling Germania would create a buffer zone protecting Gaul from barbarian incursions, secure valuable trade routes, and provide a massive source of tribute and manpower for Rome's ever-expanding military machine. The emperor's plan was elegantly simple in concept: establish Roman rule over the Germanic tribes, convert their warriors into Roman auxiliaries, transform their chieftains into Roman administrators, and gradually civilize what Romans saw as a backward, barbarous land. It was the same playbook that had worked spectacularly in Gaul, Britain, and countless other territories. To execute this grand strategy, Augustus appointed Publius Quinctilius Varus as governor of the newly created province of Germania. On paper, Varus seemed like the perfect choice. He was an experienced administrator who had successfully governed Syria, one of Rome's most challenging provinces. He had dealt with rebellious populations before and had a reputation for bringing order to chaotic situations. He was also wealthy, well-connected, and completely loyal to Augustus. But there was a fatal flaw in this appointment that would prove catastrophic. Varus was fundamentally a civilian administrator, not a military commander. His successes in Syria had come through negotiation, bribery, and administrative efficiency, not battlefield brilliance. He understood taxation, legal systems, and bureaucracy, but he had no real grasp of military strategy or the unique challenges of conquering a fiercely independent warrior culture. Varus's lack of military acumen and disregard for the Germanic tribal cultures contributed to the catastrophic outcome. While Romans saw themselves as bringing civilization to barbarians, the Germanic tribes saw Roman rule as an existential threat to their way of life, their gods, and their freedom. The Germanic tribes were not the primitive savages that Roman propaganda portrayed. They were sophisticated societies with their own complex political structures, military traditions, and fierce pride. They had been fighting Romans for generations, learning Roman tactics and developing countermeasures. They knew that once Rome established permanent control, their independence would be gone forever. By 9 CI, Varus had been in Germania for several years, gradually implementing Roman law, Roman taxation, and Roman administration. From his perspective, things were going remarkably well. The tribes seemed to be accepting Roman rule with minimal resistance. Germanic nobles were cooperating with Roman officials, disputes were being settled in Roman courts, and tribute was flowing back to Rome. What Varus didn't realize was that this apparent success was an elaborate deception orchestrated by the man he trusted most among the Germanic nobles, a young chieftain named Arminius. Chapter 2. The Perfect Trap. If you want to understand how Rome walked straight into the greatest military disaster in its history, you need to understand Arminius, because this man was the architect of what would become Rome's worst nightmare. Arminius wasn't some barbaric, tribal warrior who hated Rome from a distance. Quite the opposite. Arminius had received Roman citizenship and a Roman military education, thus allowing him to deceive the Romans methodically and anticipate their tactical responses. He was, in many ways, more Roman than Germanic, at least on the surface. Born into the royal family of the Cherusci tribe, Arminius had been taken to Rome as a young boy, essentially as a high-born hostage to ensure his tribe's good behavior. But Rome didn't treat such hostages as prisoners. Instead, they gave them the finest education money could buy, taught them Latin, immersed them in Roman culture, and trained them as officers in the Roman army. The strategy was brilliant. These young nobles would return to their tribes as passionate advocates for Roman civilization, having experienced firsthand the benefits of Roman life. For years, this strategy seemed to work perfectly with Arminius. He served with distinction as an officer in Roman legions, earned Roman citizenship, an incredible honor for a barbarian, and became fluent in both Roman military tactics and Roman political thinking. Varus saw him as living proof that Romans and Germans could work together successfully. Here was a Germanic noble who understood both worlds, who could serve as a bridge between Roman administration and tribal traditions. What Varus couldn't see was that Arminius was playing the longest, most sophisticated deception in ancient history. Every smile, every gesture of loyalty, every piece of advice was carefully calculated to lull the Romans into a false sense of security. While in this capacity, Arminius secretly plotted a Germanic revolt against Roman rule. Arminius understood something that Varus never grasped. The Germanic tribes would never truly accept permanent Roman domination. They might submit temporarily, they might pay tribute when forced, but their warrior culture and fierce independence made long-term Roman rule impossible without constant military occupation. And Arminius knew that Rome couldn't maintain such occupation indefinitely across such a vast, difficult territory. So Arminius began to weave his web. He used his position as Varus's trusted advisor to gather intelligence about Roman military plans, troop movements, and strategic thinking. He cultivated relationships with other Germanic nobles, gradually building a coalition of tribes united by their shared hatred of Roman rule. Most importantly, he convinced his co-conspirators to hide their true feelings, to play the role of loyal Roman subjects while secretly preparing for war. The deception was so complete that even when warnings reached Varus, he dismissed them entirely. He claimed that Arminius would betray Varus during the march, that Varus would be hemmed in a narrow place, and that the well-spoken, Roman-educated Arminius had secretly raised an army. A Germanic noble named Segestes, who had his own political reasons for opposing Arminius, explicitly warned Varus that his trusted advisor was planning treachery. But Varus couldn't believe that someone who seemed so thoroughly Romanized, someone who had served Rome faithfully for years, could be plotting such an elaborate betrayal. This is where Arminius's Roman education became his greatest weapon. He understood Roman thinking so completely that he could predict exactly how they would react to any situation. He knew that Romans prided themselves on their ability to civilize barbarians, and that this pride would make them dismiss warnings about Germanic treachery as the paranoid fantasies of less enlightened minds. In the autumn of 9 CE, Arminius sprung his trap. He came to Varus with disturbing news. A distant Germanic tribe was reportedly planning a rebellion against Roman rule. This couldn't be tolerated, of course. Allowing one tribe to rebel successfully might inspire others to follow suit. The situation required immediate Roman intervention to demonstrate that defying Rome had consequences. Varus decided to deal with the supposed rebellion in a prompt fashion and led his 3 legions through the Teutoburg forest, which was unfamiliar territory. From a Roman perspective, this made perfect military sense. You couldn't allow rebellion to fester and spread. You had to strike quickly and decisively to maintain the fear and respect that kept conquered peoples in line. What Varus didn't know was that there was no rebellion. The entire crisis was Arminius's invention, designed to lure the Roman legions away from their fortified bases and into terrain where Roman military advantages would be neutralized and Germanic advantages maximized. Arminius acted as a guide, and as soon as he had the chance, he informed Varus that he would leave the column to seek out local support for the Roman army. This seemed entirely reasonable to Varus. Having local support would make suppressing the rebellion much easier. He watched with complete trust as his most valuable Germanic ally rode away, supposedly to gather intelligence and rally friendly tribes to the Roman cause. In reality, Arminius was riding to his destiny as the greatest enemy Rome would face in Germania. Far from the eyes of the Romans, Arminius rejoined his Germanic kinsmen and prepared to strike. He had led the Romans into the perfect ambush. Chapter 3. Into the Dark Forest. What happened next would haunt Rome for generations. Picture the scene. 3 full Roman legions, roughly 15,000 of Rome's finest soldiers, plus auxiliary troops and camp followers, forming a massive column several miles long as they marched through the Teutoburg forest. This wasn't just any forest. It was a landscape that seemed designed by the gods themselves to neutralize every advantage that made Roman legions the most feared fighting force in the world. The Teutoburg forest was dense, dark, and treacherous. Ancient trees created a canopy so thick that even at midday, the forest floor remained shrouded in shadow. The paths were narrow, winding, and often impassable for large formations. Marsh and bog lay hidden beneath seemingly solid ground, ready to swallow men and equipment without warning. Visibility was limited to a few dozen yards in any direction, making coordination between different parts of the Roman column nearly impossible. For the Germanic warriors hiding in this forest, it was perfect hunting ground. They knew every tree, every path, every hiding place. They could move silently through terrain that would trip up heavily armored Roman soldiers. They could strike without warning and disappear like ghosts into the green darkness. A storm was brewing, metaphorically and literally. Sources recount the weather turned foul as the Romans pushed deeper into the forest. Rain began to fall, turning the already difficult paths into treacherous mudslides. The wind howled through the trees, masking the sounds of movement and making communication even more difficult than usual. Roman legions were optimized for fighting in open terrain, where their disciplined formations, coordinated tactics, and superior equipment could dominate any enemy. In the Teutoburg forest, these advantages became liabilities. The famous Roman testudo, tortoise formation, was useless when you couldn't see your enemy and could barely maintain formation on narrow, winding paths. Their heavy armor, which provided excellent protection in pitched battle, became exhausting dead weight in the forest's humid, oppressive atmosphere. But the Romans pressed on, confident in their superiority, and trusting in their Germanic guide who had promised to lead them to victory. They had no idea that they were walking into the most carefully planned ambush in military history. The attack, when it came, was devastating in its coordination and brutality. The Germanic leader Arminius organized a series of ambushes on a column of 3 Roman legions headed by Publius Quinctilius Varus. This wasn't a single battle. It was a rolling massacre that continued for days. Germanic warriors struck from every direction simultaneously. Arrows and spears flew from behind trees and from elevated positions that the Romans couldn't see, let alone reach. Warriors would charge out of the underbrush, strike with devastating effect, then disappear back into the forest before the Romans could organize a counterattack. The forest itself seemed to have come alive with enemies. Roman sources indicate that over the course of 4 days, Arminius destroyed all 3 legions. 4 days of absolute hell, where Roman military discipline gradually crumbled under the relentless, terrifying pressure of an enemy that could strike anywhere at any time, but could never be pinned down for a decisive battle. The Romans tried everything. They attempted to form defensive squares, but the terrain made tight formations impossible to maintain. They tried to break out of the forest, but every path seemed to lead deeper into the nightmare. They tried to build fortified camps at night, but the Germanic warriors would attack the instant any Roman stepped outside the perimeter, making foraging for food or water a death sentence. As the days wore on, Roman morale collapsed. These were soldiers who had conquered half the known world, but they were being systematically destroyed by enemies they could barely see. Wounded men cried out in the darkness. Supplies ran low, then ran out entirely. The stench of death filled the air as bodies piled up and couldn't be properly buried. The result was a bloodbath that lasted 3 days, and up to 30,000 people were killed. This number included not just the legionaries themselves, but also auxiliary troops, camp followers, merchants, and civilians who had been traveling with the army. Varus watched his legions disintegrate around him. The man who had been so confident in his ability to manage Germanic affairs realized too late that he had been played for a fool. Varus understood that there was no escape. Rather than face certain torture at the hands of the Germans, he chose suicide, falling on his sword as Roman tradition prescribed. The death of Varus effectively ended any hope of organized Roman resistance. Most of his commanders followed suit, leaving their troops leaderless in what had become a killing field. Without leadership, without hope, without any possibility of victory or escape, the remaining Roman soldiers were systematically hunted down and destroyed. In one of the most chilling details of the entire catastrophe, Arminius cut off Varus's head and sent it to Bohemia as a present to Maroboduus of the Marcomanni, hoping to convince another major Germanic leader to join his anti-Roman alliance. It was a grisly trophy that represented not just the death of a Roman governor, but the death of Roman dreams of conquering Germania. Chapter 4. Why did Rome suffer such a shocking military defeat? So how did this all happen? How did the most powerful military machine in the ancient world walk straight into such a catastrophic defeat? The Battle of Teutoburg Forest wasn't just bad luck or superior Germanic tactics. It was the result of multiple compounding Roman failures that turned their greatest strengths into fatal weaknesses. The first and perhaps most critical failure was intelligence. Rome had built an empire by gathering information about their enemies, understanding their capabilities and intentions, and planning accordingly. But in Germania, the Romans were operating blind, and worse than blind, they were actively being fed false information by the very people they trusted most. All agree that the disaster was the result of German treachery and Roman miscalculation. Arminius didn't just betray Rome. He systematically corrupted Roman intelligence gathering for years. Every report Varus received about Germanic tribal politics, every assessment of potential threats, every piece of strategic advice was filtered through Arminius and his network of co-conspirators. The Romans thought they understood the situation in Germania, but they were actually living in an elaborate fantasy constructed by their enemies. This intelligence failure was compounded by Roman arrogance. Romans genuinely believed in their cultural and military superiority, and this belief made them dismiss warnings that contradicted their preconceptions. When Segestes warned Varus about Arminius's treachery, Varus couldn't believe it because it didn't fit his worldview. A Germanic noble who had been educated in Rome, who spoke Latin fluently, who had served in Roman legions, such a person was obviously civilized and therefore obviously loyal to Rome. The second major failure was tactical inflexibility. Roman legions were incredibly effective fighting machines, but they were optimized for specific types of warfare. On open ground, in pitched battle, against enemies who would stand and fight, Roman legions were virtually unstoppable. But the Teutoburg Forest neutralized every Roman advantage while maximizing Germanic strengths. Roman commanders had faced forest warfare before, and they had developed tactics for dealing with such terrain. But those tactics required time, preparation, and most importantly, the assumption that you were entering hostile territory. Varus led his legions into the forest as if he were marching through friendly Roman territory, with no special precautions, no scouting ahead, no consideration for the tactical disadvantages he was accepting. The column formation that the Romans used was entirely inappropriate for the terrain and the threat. A column, several miles long, stretched out along narrow forest paths, couldn't coordinate effectively or concentrate force where needed. When attacks came from multiple directions simultaneously, different parts of the column were fighting separate battles with no ability to support each other. Even more fundamentally, Roman military doctrine was based on the assumption that enemies would eventually offer pitched battle, where Roman discipline and equipment could decisive advantages. The Germanic strategy of hit-and-run attacks, of never offering a fixed target for Roman retaliation, completely frustrated Roman tactical thinking. The third failure was strategic. Rome had achieved remarkable success by converting conquered enemies into allies, by offering the benefits of Roman citizenship and Roman law to those who submitted. This strategy had worked brilliantly in many places, but it required a fundamental willingness on the part of the conquered people to accept Roman rule. The Germanic tribes, particularly the warrior culture that Arminius represented, would never truly accept Roman domination. Their entire identity was built around concepts of personal freedom, tribal loyalty, and martial honor that were incompatible with Roman imperial administration. Rome could force temporary submission through military occupation, but permanent control would require permanent military presence on a scale that was economically and logistically impossible. Varus and his superiors in Rome failed to grasp this fundamental incompatibility. They assumed that Germanic tribes could be integrated into the Roman system, the same way that Gallic tribes had been. But Germania was not Gaul, and the Germanic tribes were not Celts. The cultural and social differences were too profound to be bridged by administrative efficiency and economic incentives. The fourth failure was military overconfidence. Roman legions had been so successful for so long that they had begun to believe their own propaganda about Roman invincibility. This overconfidence led to carelessness in planning, inadequate preparation for contingencies, and a fatal underestimation of Germanic military capabilities. The Germanic tribes were not the primitive barbarians that Roman prejudice portrayed. They were experienced warriors who had been fighting Romans for generations. They had studied Roman tactics, learned from previous defeats, and developed sophisticated countermeasures. The Germanic tribes, under the leadership of Arminius, a chieftain of the Cherusci, succeeded in luring the Romans into an ambush because they understood Roman psychology and Roman military doctrine better than the Romans understood Germanic capabilities. Finally, there was the failure of leadership. Varus was simply the wrong man for the job. His skills as an administrator were irrelevant in a military crisis, and his lack of combat experience became fatal when the situation deteriorated. A more experienced military commander might have recognized the warning signs, questioned Arminius's motives more carefully, or at least taken better precautions when marching through dangerous territory. When the ambush began, Varus proved incapable of adapting to the new reality. He couldn't devise effective countermeasures to Germanic tactics, couldn't maintain morale among his troops, and couldn't provide the kind of decisive leadership that might have salvaged something from the disaster. The combination of all these failures created a perfect storm of catastrophe. Roman intelligence failures walked them into the trap. Roman tactical inflexibility prevented effective response once the trap was sprung. Roman strategic misunderstanding meant they never should have been there in the first place. Roman overconfidence made them careless about preparation and precautions, and Roman leadership failures meant that when things went wrong, they went completely, catastrophically wrong. The defeat not only stopped the growth of the Roman Empire, but also created the Latin-Germanic divide that persists in Western Europe to this day. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest didn't just destroy 3 legions, it redrew the map of Europe and set limits on Roman power that would never be overcome. When news of the disaster reached Rome, the Roman Emperor Augustus nightly wander his palace, shouting for the defeated commander, Publius Quinctilius Varus, to give him back his legions. Those legions were never reconstituted. Their numbers were never reused. The psychological trauma of the defeat was so severe that Rome essentially abandoned its dreams of conquering Germania. The battle marked the end of Roman attempts to annex Germania east of the Rhine, solidifying the river as the empire's northern boundary. What had been intended as a temporary frontier became a permanent border that would define European geography for centuries. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest stands as one of history's greatest examples of how military disasters happen not through single catastrophic mistakes, but through the accumulation of multiple failures that reinforce and amplify each other. Rome's greatest strengths, their confidence, their systematic approach to conquest, their trust in civilizing barbarians, became the very weaknesses that led them into the dark heart of the Teutoburg Forest, where Arminius and his warriors were waiting to teach the masters of the world that even Rome had limits. And in that dark German forest, surrounded by the bodies of his legions and the wreckage of his ambitions, Varus learned too late that sometimes the price of underestimating your enemies is not just defeat, but annihilation. So there you have it, the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, and the story behind one of Rome's most humiliating military defeats. If you liked this video, then please click the like and subscribe buttons. That way you'll never miss another episode of Ancient Rome Revisited. If you liked this video, then you will also like this video entitled A Day in the Life of a Roman Legionnaire. This video will take you inside the daily routines and training practices that made the legionnaires the strongest, most devastating army in the ancient world. I know you'll love it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you there.